It is game day on Gamecock Central Radio. Emerson Phillips with the Gamecock Central crew here. Wes Mitchell joining me. And Wes, we got a huge ball game today with South Carolina and Vanderbilt. Obviously a big game every year because it is an SEC East matchup, but it seems like Carolina and Vanderbilt, 4 o'clock kickoff today on the SEC Network from Nashville, is huge for both of these ball clubs, maybe bigger this year than in years past, Wes.
Yeah, it's crazy. You know, I think, Emerson, we probably would not have circled this game with being really anybody involved with the South Carolina program, whether you're a fan, media member, whatever else. We wouldn't have circled this football game on the schedule prior to the season as being one of the even maybe top half, I think, games as far as most importance. But now you look at it, Vandy maybe is a little bit better than we thought they were going to be. South Carolina, we don't know what they are yet. And with the way Georgia handled South Carolina 2 weekends ago, you look at this thing and you say, South Carolina needs a win for their season to be on track for what they want it to be and what they thought it could be preseason and all those things. And as I believe you were hearing earlier this week, it sounds like this is a pretty dang big game for Vanderbilt on a sort of maybe big picture as far as the Derek Mason era. Is that correct?
Yeah, Chris Lee with VandySports.com joined us on Gamecock Central Radio for Vanderbilt preview earlier this week. He gave us the Vanderbilt perspective, and he said that he thinks this is the biggest game for Derek Mason since Mason took over at Vanderbilt. I thought that was a strong statement.
Whew, yeah, and man, to me, anytime, and obviously, you know, Chris is very close to that program and has been covering it for a number of years, so I would get the impression that's maybe not just his opinion. You know, that may be something that's sort of permeating that program right now. And if so, to me, that's kind of dangerous. You know, I think anytime you build a game up to that hype, to that level of hype, I should say, it can be dangerous for your team. It puts a lot of extra pressure on them. I think South Carolina, frankly, played with a lot of extra pressure on them 2 weeks ago against Georgia.
Yep.
They did not look like they're calm, just business executing, you know, selves like they did against Coastal Carolina. So, you know, that's dangerous. I think this is probably a Vanderbilt team that, despite the loss to Notre Dame, probably comes into this game with some confidence. But anytime you put that much pressure on one game, it can be tough. You know, the teams that are really good in big games are the ones that are used to being in big games and don't really treat a big game like it's a big game.
Right. Notre Dame edged out Vanderbilt last Saturday in South Bend. It was 22-17, and Vandy really had opportunities to win that ball game. Notre Dame was ranked 8th in the country going in, and Vanderbilt, you know, were it not for a couple of turnovers in that ball game, one of them occurring inside of the Notre Dame 5-yard line, Vanderbilt really was in good shape to win that football game, and they outplayed Notre Dame for stretches in a game that was played in South Bend. So I watched the entire ball game last week, Wes, and I came away very impressed with Vanderbilt, particularly their quarterback, Kyle Shermer. So we're going to talk more about him as we move through the Game Day podcast today. We're also going to take your phone calls on the Gamecock Central hotline, and we'll have keys to victory later in the podcast today from our Collyn Taylor, who's our staff writer with Gamecock Central, and from Chris Lee from VandySports.com. So, Wes, let's talk about Vanderbilt a little bit more before we move on to the Gamecock perspective heading in today's 4 o'clock kickoff on the SEC Network. Why is this the biggest game in Derek Mason's Vanderbilt career? Well, it seems like Vanderbilt might be at a crossroads. They've got plenty of talent offensively, and it seems that, you know, coming off this performance against 8th-ranked Notre Dame, a game that they could have easily won, you know, they're going to go one of two directions here, Wes, and if they can beat South Carolina today, you know, South Carolina, with the exception of Georgia, South Carolina is probably the best team left on Vanderbilt's schedule. They feel like they've got a lot of winnable games on the schedule after South Carolina today. Georgia being the one game where they'll be the obvious underdog, but they closed the season with 7 consecutive conference games, and they feel like at least 6 of them are winnable. So if they can beat Carolina today, you know, they got a good chance to finish with 9 wins or more, and that will be something else for Vanderbilt.
Yeah, it would, and I think when you hear that, you know, biggest game of the Derek Mason era, my initial thought is where does the line get drawn for the Vanderbilt administration, the Vanderbilt fan base, you know, anybody involved in that program? Where is the line sort of drawn of what is acceptable as far as the expectations go within this program. And I don't have that answer. Obviously, I think if you put a team on the field that competes week in, week out, and stays out of trouble, and I think, frankly, does what they're supposed to do in the classroom as well, that's important at Vanderbilt just because of what that school is all about and the reputation of that school. So if a coach does all those things, are you really going to get rid of Derek Mason because he doesn't compete in the SEC East, or compete to win the SEC East, I should say? In my opinion, probably not. But college football, it's rarely fair to coaches. The expectations, especially because of what they're paid, are very, very high. So, I think you look at a situation there where, you had a guy in James Franklin who sort of maybe re-challenged what we think of with Vanderbilt and what the expectations can be. And the fan base saw that. So much like, not that it was to the level that Spurrier won at South Carolina, but much like the expectations for what is possible at South Carolina got shifted by Steve Spurrier, I think you look at what James Franklin did, in his time at Vanderbilt, and maybe the expectations for what's possible, even if it's not realistic year in, year out, get shifted a little bit.
So Vanderbilt's got Ole Miss and Arkansas from the SEC West on their schedule. And, Wes, if you were going to hand pick the two teams from the West that you were going to play, those would be the two you pick.
Yeah, and, they're not chanting, "We want Bama" this year. I think there were some Vandy fans chanting that prior to the game last year. And at the time, this Vandy team actually was off to a decent start to that season. And then, I think we're 3-0, and about 59-0 points later, the Vanderbilt team and the Vanderbilt defense never recovered from that at all. So, I think this Vandy team is improved. The eyeball test says that, but at the same time, they started fairly quick last year and then just got battered by Alabama and were never quite the same. So I don't think anybody anywhere close to Nashville is sad that the Alabama Crimson Tide are not on the schedule this year.
Right. Vanderbilt's 2-1 coming in, wins over Middle Tennessee State and Nevada, and the loss by just 5 points last week at 8th-ranked Notre Dame. So the Gamecocks come in 1-1, and let's talk about the Gamecock perspective here, Wes. 2 weeks since the Georgia game, and it feels like 2 months, Wes, because talk about the loss to Georgia continued into the second week. The Marshall game was canceled last week due to Hurricane Florence, and bad feelings have lingered for Gamecock fans at least into the second week. Even though we've been getting ready for Vanderbilt all week, people are still talking about that Georgia game.
Yeah, they are, and I think it goes back to what I was talking about, about Vanderbilt sort of building this football game up. The South Carolina-Georgia game gets built up every year, but I think you look at this one, the fact that it was a home game, the fact that we're looking on paper and seeing, hey, Georgia lost so much on defense. This is a team, at least me personally, I thought South Carolina's offense was going to be able to exploit Georgia's defense, and it got built up. I'll take some blame for that too. I mean, I thought South Carolina was going to win the football game. I definitely thought they were going to go compete. So then when you have that in your mind, that's what the expectation is, and then you go out there and it's not close. It's a steep fall, it's rough. And these fans, especially on Gamecock Central message boards, are your diehard of your diehard fans who put everything they have into it. These are also your people that make your program sustainable. So, I think you look at this team and you certainly hope that the team has put it behind them a little bit quicker than maybe the fan base has. But I think just like you said, the fact that it has lingered for 2 weeks, we'll find out if that's good or bad for the football team. But it has not been good for the psyche of the average Gamecock fan, I don't think.
From a fan's perspective, the bad feelings have lingered. There's no question about that. And had Carolina played Marshall as scheduled last Saturday, you have to feel like, the Georgia game would have at least been put in the rearview mirror to some degree. But as of, late in the week, this week, folks were still talking about that Georgia game here in Columbia and in South Carolina. So, Wes, that brings us to another interesting point. What about the missing of the Marshall game? it seems like maybe it would have helped Carolina to have played that game on Saturday just to put that Georgia game in the rearview mirror and forget about it, move on from it. And they were not afforded that opportunity because the Marshall game was canceled.
Yeah, I think, especially if they had gone and played well.
Right.
They go out there and stink it up, then it's
different
even
story.
Worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, the Louisiana Tech game last year came right on the heels of that bad Kentucky loss. And, there was a lot of upset people after that game, rightfully so, even though South Carolina found a way to win. But the great thing about college football is that South Carolina, the very next week, there's nobody on the planet who was picking them to beat Texas A&M, and they go to Texas A&M and have the lead, fairly late in the second half. And, you're saying, where was this team at last week? So week to week, it's very easy to look at what happened against Georgia and get caught up and be like, is this what this South Carolina football team is? But, if we look big picture, I think college football has taught us every single year that we never quite know as much about these teams as we think we do as far as how a game is going to play out. And two, especially with this team this year, I mean, what do we know, Emerson? I mean, like you said, there's only been 2 games. Everybody else, we at least have 3 games. Not everybody, but most of the teams, we have 3 games worth of knowledge of data, if you will. South Carolina, we only have 2 games, and they were 2 completely opposite games with not really much in common for either one of them. So I think this week and looking ahead to next week, Kentucky, circle the next 2 weeks. If South Carolina is 2-0, then the fan base, I think, can take a relaxing breath and breathe again. If South Carolina loses one of these games, then it makes it tough to start hitting those win totals that we talked about preseason.
All right, we're going to let you hear from Derek Mason today. He's got an interesting comment from his midweek press conference talking about this South Carolina-Vanderbilt game. And, Wes, one of the backdrop stories, or really one of the foreground stories of this matchup today is the fact that Carolina has beaten Vanderbilt 9 straight ball games, and South Carolina is 23-4 all time against the Commodores. This is the one team in the SEC that the Gamecocks have beaten consistently. Even when Vanderbilt's had good teams, the Gamecocks always seem to find a way to win.
Yeah, they have just mashed Vanderbilt when you look at the records. I was looking through the notes that USC gives out, and South Carolina literally has the best record against Vanderbilt among every single team that they have played at least 10 times all time. Every team South Carolina has played 10 times or more, they have the best record against Vanderbilt, better record than any other team they've played. But then you start, and that record is 852. But then you start looking at the last decade, where South Carolina has won 9 straight. They're 23-4 overall. They're 12-2 in Nashville. They're 11-2 in Columbia. So you look at that and you say, well, South Carolina's dominated Vanderbilt. But then you start looking closer and you look at the actual matchups over those years, and you see close game after close game after close game. And, I think that makes it dangerous because you're probably going to have another close game this weekend. Vegas certainly thinks so as well. I've seen that line right around the 2 number, 2.5.
Yep. And,
you look at that and you say, how many times can you beat a team in close games? At some point, does it even out to some extent? I don't know, but it's just weird to think that you can be in so many close games with a team and have that good a record against them.
So the Gamecocks trying to make it 10 straight wins over Vanderbilt today. And, I don't know. We talked with Chris Lee from Vandy Sports earlier this week. He said that Mason did not bring that up in his midweek press conference this week. We don't know that Vandy's talked about that at all in-house. But I got to believe, West, that this becomes a sticking point at some point. When you lose 9 straight to a team that you play every year, that's got to be something that you talk about at some point. And if you're not talking about it, maybe that's why you can't beat this team. Maybe that's why you're losing to them every year.
Well, and I think, let's be honest, other teams around the conference or around the country don't look at South Carolina in the same light that they do a Georgia or even though they've been down a Florida or a Tennessee. Like, let's just be honest. So if you're Vanderbilt, the fact that it's not Tennessee or Florida that you've lost to 9 straight times, or Georgia that you've lost to 9 straight times. In this case, we're talking about losing to South Carolina 9 straight times. So that I'm sure that hurts, considering how many, like we're talking about, how many of those games they've been in. I mean, these football games that are 3-point games or 4-point games or 7-point games, how many plays, if you go back to those games, probably actually come down to? You know, it's a handful of plays. Elliott Fry drills a 55-yard field goal to beat you in a game that, you know, it's easy to forget. Vanderbilt was up 10 points against South Carolina in that game 2 years ago in Nashville, on the first game of the Muschamp era, and South Carolina finds a way to win and drills a field goal from distance. So there have not only have you lost, but there's been some tough losses along the way.
Yeah, suffice to say, the Gamecocks have not hit too many 55-yarders over the years. So, Wes, we talked about the Gamecocks and what a big game this is, the 2-week hangover, if you will, from the Georgia loss. So what we've got is a 2-game sample for South Carolina this year. You know, a good performance in a win against, obviously, an overmatched Coastal Carolina team. But the Gamecocks really looked strong. You know, the offense moved the football from start to finish, and the defense did the job. So we thought the Gamecocks, you know, played about the way we expected them to, frankly, against Coastal Carolina. But then came out against Georgia. The 6 drop passes, obviously well documented at this point, and Carolina just got run over, particularly in that third quarter, by that very strong Georgia ground game. Over 200 yards rushing in the third quarter alone for Georgia in that 41-17 win at Williams-Brice. So this was a 20-10 game at halftime, and Georgia just beat the brakes off the Gamecocks in the second half. So which South Carolina team is the real Gamecock team, Wes? What do we really know about this team headed into today's game at Vandy?
Yeah, I asked that very question on our Gamecock Central message board. Basically, what do you expect from the game tomorrow? And it's somewhere in the middle of those two things. I think that's always the case. That's the easy answer. But, you know, I think this team is clearly far better than what we saw out of them against Georgia. Now, did Georgia maybe expose a few weaknesses? Absolutely. But how many more? I think the big question I go back to is how many more teams on this schedule have the ability or the size up front offensively on your line, or the speed outside that Georgia possesses. How many teams left on the schedule also have the ability to exploit your weaknesses that Georgia maybe showed? I think Georgia, in some ways, did things that they would have done to about any team had any team made the mistakes South Carolina did. You know, if you if you give up a pick 6 to Georgia, then you're putting yourself in a hole right off the bat. You're probably not going to win the game. Your percentage goes down, immensely right at that moment. So now I think going back to Coastal, they showed they can execute. None of those drives on offense were flukes. They were all full length of the field drives. No short fields, no defensive scores, no special team scores. Those were legitimate and efficient offensive drives. So I go back to how do the matchups look against some of these teams. South Carolina is going to match up way better than they did against Georgia. To me, it's going to, for every week, the question is going to be, can they run the football against the front 7 of the team that they're playing that week? And if they can, I think everything else falls into place, and then your playmakers on the outside can make plays. And this can be an offense that scores, 30-something points every game that's a positive to their favor. If you look at the matchup offensively and say the defensive front of the other team is probably going to own this matchup, then I think you're going to say South Carolina is going to be about where they were against Georgia as far as their point totals put up. It's going to be hard for them to put up a bunch of points. So the question becomes, what's the matchup this week? South Carolina's front and their running backs, which has been part of the conversation this week too. How much of it is on the offensive line? Will Muschamp has been fairly happy with his offensive line. And how much of it is saying, hey, these running backs need to break tackles. They need to make somebody miss. me personally, I'd get A.J. Turner back in there a little bit more. He runs hard. He's not the most talented back, but he's going to give you every ounce you got. So, maybe you throw him out there and let him try to boost things a little bit. But to me, that's the incredibly long-winded way of saying we have no idea, Emerson.
All right, so one of the concerns I have about this game from a South Carolina perspective, Wes, is that, Notre Dame beat Vandy largely on the strength of a strong running game. Tony Jones Jr., the Notre Dame tailback, ran for 100-plus yards in the ball game, and Notre Dame's quarterback, Wimbush, is a good runner as well. He ran for 84 yards, and it was a really kind of a smash-mouth Notre Dame ground attack that was the difference in that ball game. That's not South Carolina's brand of football, Wes.
No, it's not, and I think it's going to have to be to an extent this week. I went back and I looked at the game, as I almost always do. I looked at the game from last year between South Carolina and Vanderbilt, and to me, the difference in that football game was the fact that South Carolina was able to consistently run the ball, and Vanderbilt was not. When we go to our hotline question here in a moment, I think it kind of matches what we're talking about. Yeah. But, you look, and I've got the numbers in front of me right now. Dallas Rivers, one of their running backs, 11 carries for 41 yards. Ralph Webb, 6 carries for 31 yards. They had a couple of guys that had runs on reverses, but Blossomgame, 2 carries for 7 yards. So Vanderbilt rushed for 107 yards on 23 carries last year. South Carolina rushed for 212 yards on 37 carries last year, a 5.7 yards per carry, and 3 touchdowns. So South Carolina sort of, even though it was a close game, they controlled the football game with their running game, and even got Jake Bentley involved in the running game as well. 6 carries, 47 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, you look at what Vanderbilt did against Notre Dame, they did a pretty good job for the most part of keeping Wimbush in the pocket. So, we don't think of Bentley as being a running threat, but last year that was a big part of the reason that South Carolina was able to win the game. So that's something that I'm going to be focused on this week as well.
Gamecocks ran the football only 16 times against Georgia, and I know they were playing from behind much of the second half. That didn't help, obviously, but Carolina just did nothing on the ground against the Bulldogs. Obviously, Georgia's defense more formidable than Vanderbilt, so maybe that's a cause for optimism ahead of today's 4 o'clock kickoff in Nashville. It will be on the SEC Network, and this is the Gamecock Central Game Day podcast. I'm Emerson Phillips, Wes Mitchell alongside today. Wes, let's go ahead and go to the Gamecock Central hotline. We got a call here from Sean. He is from Tucker, Georgia, and Sean's got a question for you about today's ball game. Let's listen in.
Hey, this is Sean from Tucker, Georgia, the hometown of Gamecocks Dylan Wanham and Josh Vann and Aaron Sterling. Anyway, I've got a question about Vanderbilt's offense. I know Coach Muschamp in the press conference said that he thought Vanderbilt would try to run a balanced game, but Vanderbilt wasn't looking particularly balanced at all versus Notre Dame. They're very heavily passed, and I just wondered if you think the Gamecocks are going to be able to really stifle the Vandy run game today? And if so, do you expect the Gamecocks to really be able to take advantage of that and shut down the passing game as well? All right, just your thoughts there on what Vandy's going to run and how the Gamecocks are going to respond. Thanks.
Really good question from Sean there, Emerson. And, I want to encourage everybody listening to call in because we will put you on. Another good question. We had a couple of good questions for the Georgia game last week. And appreciate Sean getting us there. But, I think he makes a good point. They were able to throw the football against Notre Dame last week, and I think that goes back to Kyle Shermer and the fact that, this guy is, to me, one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the conference, possibly even the country, So I think you look at them, though, and like we're talking about, the fact that South Carolina was able to run the football last year, Vanderbilt was not in that ball game. Kyle Shermer still put up big numbers. He torched Carolina, 27 for 49, 333 yards, 4 touchdowns, and just 1 pick. But just the fact that South Carolina was forcing him to beat them alone, and there wasn't that balance, that was the difference in the football game. So I think if you if you look at the game this week, and Vanderbilt is having success with both of those things, they're able to run the football, and Kyle Shermer's having a big day, then South Carolina's probably losing the football game. So I think when Muschamp talks about having to stop the run, he's just talking about the fact that when you're running the football, it gives your offense that consistency. It gives it that efficiency. You can throw the football on first down because you know that you can follow up on second down and get 5, 6, 7 yards in the running game. You're confident and you're comfortable as a play caller when you have the running game to give you that consistency up front. So I think what Muschamp is saying is that when Vandy's really good on offense, it's because they're able to pair that running game with a quarterback like Kyle Shermer, just like what we're talking about with South Carolina and Jake Bentley. If South Carolina can pair that running game with what they have in the passing game with these really good receivers, then they're tough to beat. So to me, you probably it's a long-term proven key in every single football game. You can look at the rushing totals, but especially this week with all the talk about South Carolina in the running game, and then Muschamp talking about Vandy's running game, whichever team has the better numbers there is probably going to win this football game.
All right, Sean, thanks for the phone call. 497-9058. If you want to join us on the GC hotline, get your questions in now for the Kentucky game. You call in, you leave a voice message, and we'll play your question on the air during next week's Game Day podcast. That number again, 803-497-9058, Gamecock Central hotline, available 24/7. Wes, you talked about Shermer, and he's another reason that I'm concerned for the Gamecocks today. I think Shermer is a very able quarterback. After watching that Notre Dame game in particular, he's a good decision maker. He's got the arm strength, and I like his feet. Wes, a football coach that I taught with years ago, told me that when you're evaluating a quarterback, you don't look at his arm, you look at his feet. And Shermer's got good feet. He's quiet in the pocket. He's very calm. You can tell he's composed. He's a cool customer, and I think he gives Vanderbilt a chance to win most any given Saturday. And you couple that with the fact that Vanderbilt's got some really talented skill players. Kalijah Lipscomb, their wide receiver, leads the SEC in receptions, and they got a tight end that is the top pass catcher among SEC tight ends right now. He leads the country, in fact, in receptions by tight end. Vandy's got weapons on offense, and Shermer is the type of quarterback that can distribute the football to them.
Yeah, they really do. And Jared Pinkney is the tight end you're talking about. He's a guy that I think is probably going to the NFL. I think he's a draft pick. You don't really think about Vandy and offensive, weapons going to the NFL, but they've had a decent little run here lately where they've been able to get some guys that have NFL athleticism, and Jared Pinkney is starting to show in his play. I think he was an upside guy his first 2 years where you saw some ability, but he's put it all together, and I think that's helped, obviously, Kyle Shermer, giving him another big target. When you're worried about the running game, they are a pro-style scheme. When you're worried about the running game, and then give him the ability to go play action and get that tight end back behind the linebackers, that's a weapon. And I think you look at Shermer, you can tell this is the son of a coach. A lot of times when a kid has been around the game his entire life, it just they exude that confidence and that comfortability in there. And I think you look at Pat Shermer, who actually is the offense coordinator for the Giants, has been in the NFL with a number of teams for a number of years. You can tell that, his kid has picked up a lot from him. So I think for South Carolina, if it gets to a point, and this is another one of those things that just is way easier for us to talk about than it is to actually go do it. But if he's getting in situations where he's able to just drop back without much of a rush in his face, then, he's gonna put up big numbers. He's gonna rip Carolina's secondary apart. So at the end of the day, it goes back to trying to get him uncomfortable, to get him off of his steps, to make him try to do things he doesn't enjoy doing. Because, I thought Muschamp, he put it pretty well. This guy's going to look at your defense, and he's going to know what's coming pre-snap a lot of times. He's seen it all. He's a 4-year starter. There's not much you can show pre-snap that's going to confuse him. So it's going to be all about what happens post-snap.
4 o'clock kickoff for the Gamecocks and the Commodores on the SEC Network. And Wes, we talked about Vanderbilt's offense extensively here. I wanted to talk about their defense a little bit. Chris Lee from VandySports.com, who will have Vanderbilt's keys to victory for us here in just a few minutes, told us on Gamecock Central this week that the Vandy defensive line is undersized, and they've had a pretty good pass rush last year and the early part of this year, but they didn't get much of a pass rush against Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame only threw 23 passes in the ball game. That was obviously a factor. And Wimbush is mobile. But Vanderbilt's D-line, a little bit undersized, and Chris Lee was concerned about Vandy against a big offensive line, and he thinks that could be a matchup advantage for the Gamecocks.
Yeah, I think you look at it, and you look at the size South Carolina does have up front, and you look at, particularly on the interior, Donnell Stanley, Zach Bailey, Kadarius Hutchinson, and sort of that inside zone running game that has been a part of what South Carolina has done over the years. That's probably something you can circle when we're talking about, can South Carolina run the football? Can they establish the run this week? And they need to sort of tire those guys out. The best way to negate a pass rush is to not let them get into situations where they know you're going to have to pass. So I really, Emerson, think the game plan this week is probably completely opposite from what we saw the first drive 2 weeks ago. I think South Carolina probably comes out, and just because of all they've talked about the last couple of weeks, I think they probably run the ball 6-7 out of the first 10 times out there, 10 plays out there, just because they need to sort of establish that they can do that and put Vandy in a situation where they're getting leaned on in the running game and aren't able to just pin their ears back and rush your passer and get in those third and long situations, which that's where, this is an aggressive Vanderbilt defense. They have a new defensive coordinator. They're much more aggressive. They're going to come at you. They're going to be very, very exotic at times in their pressures, but you negate all that stuff if it's 3rd and 3. The only time that stuff is going to fly is if you're in 3rd and 10s and 3rd and 12s. And, if you can run the football on early downs, then, you negate all that stuff because it creates easy, when it's 3rd and 2 and you bring the house, that creates easy completions underneath for the first down. So I think they're an improved defense. They have some playmakers. They're pretty fast, I think, and they're going to get after you when they can. But that's why it'll be key for South Carolina, like you said, to kind of take advantage of that maybe size advantage that they have up front.
All right, the Gamecocks are a 2.5-point favorite in Nashville today for a big ball game between the Gamecocks and the Commodores. Let's go ahead and listen in to Derek Mason. I thought this was an interesting soundbite from his midweek press conference earlier this week.
South Carolina Gamecocks coming into town, and this game's going to be a street fight. This game's going to be a street fight. I mean, some of you guys don't know who Kimbo Slice is. Hopefully you do. And you go back to it, man, this isn't a sanctioned fight. This is a street fight. I mean, this is the SEC. So, man, it's time to put on the hard hat, lunch pail, let's get to work.
So that's Derek Mason, Wes, Vanderbilt head coach, saying it's going to be a street fight today.
Yeah, I think he's right, man. These are physical games between these two teams every single time they play. And, Vandy is one of those teams that they hit you, what's the saying, until the echo of the whistle. Like, they get in their shot. So they walk right on that line of being physical and being a little over physical. So, I think that's something to watch in this football game. This is a team that has to play with a chip on their shoulder because of who they are. They're almost never the most purely talented team on the field when they're playing conference games. So they have to find their advantage somewhere else. And you're talking about two programs that build their reputation around the idea of, we're going to try to out-physical you. And, I think you have two defensive-minded head coaches that try to instill that, not just in their defense, but in their entire team. So I wouldn't be surprised if it gets a little chippy in the game. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little extracurricular activity after some plays. But it's going to be a dogfight, man. I think both teams are going to have some extra bumps and bruises after this one.
No doubt about it. Before we get you today's keys to victory, let's take a look at the SEC schedule today. Georgia, ranked number 2 in the country, is at Missouri. That's a noon kickoff. Georgia's a 14-point favorite there. SEC opener for Missouri. Non-con game for Ole Miss, noon kickoff against Kent State. The big game in the SEC today is Alabama hosting Texas A&M. A&M broke into the polls at number 22. They're only lost a 2-point loss at home to Clemson a couple of weeks ago. Bama's a 26-point favorite in this game. Carolina Vanderbilt 4 o'clock kickoff. Carolina by 2.5. LSU hosting Louisiana Tech. LSU has not lost to an in-state opponent since the early 80s. They lost to Tulane about 35 years ago. That was the last time LSU was beaten by an in-state school. Kentucky, coming off the win at Florida a couple weeks ago, 1-0 in SEC play, hosting 14th-ranked Mississippi State. It's the conference opener for the Bulldogs. They're 3-0. That's a pretty good matchup, too, there, Wes. I hear Kentucky, a lot of folks are saying Kentucky's got the best team maybe they've ever had.
Yeah, we're going to learn a lot about Kentucky this week because I tell you, Joe Moorhead, I like the job he's done with Mississippi State so far. He walked into a situation where he's got a really good quarterback that can make things happen with his arm and his feet. So it's not like he was walking into one of these situations where the cupboard is bare. So, but he's done well so far, and I think we're gonna that Kentucky talk about one of the best teams in Kentucky history may be a little premature, but I think we know a lot about that team. Set by Saturday night by the end of the day because there's going to be as soon as this game is over between South Carolina and Vandy. The entire Gamecock fan base will start officially worrying about Kentucky.
That's right. Well, we know this about Kentucky. I don't know if this is one of the best teams they've ever had, but this Kentucky team did something that no previous Kentucky team had done in, 30 years. They won against Florida. In fact, this Kentucky team won in Gainesville 2 weeks ago, 27-16. So Kentucky's 3-0. Mississippi State's 3-0. That's a 7 o'clock ball game on ESPN2. Also a 7 o'clock kickoff tonight for Florida and Tennessee. Daggum, Wes, you think about this ball game. This game had national championship implications every year for like a decade, it seemed like. But not the case this year, you wouldn't think, with both teams 2-1. It's Tennessee's SEC opener. Florida's 0-1 in the league. 7 o'clock kick on ESPN. Gators are favored by 4.5.
I mean, what alternate reality have we stepped into, Emerson? Because, dude, I mean, Florida, Tennessee is like a borderline lock for CBS game of the week, 3:30. In my sort of growing up formative years of watching college football,
yep.
This is a lock for being the national game of the week. And I'm still mad in our Gamecock Central pick'em. I'm looking at Kentucky, Florida last week, and I'm like, that's a virtual lock too. You always pick Florida to beat Kentucky. You don't even think twice about it.
Yeah.
And so I take an L there because Kentucky beats Florida, and we're not talking about the game of basketball. The Cleveland Browns are winning football games. Ryan Fitzpatrick is the NFL MVP so far. I don't know where we are. We slipped into an alternate reality of some type. But this stuff is weird, man. And you got Kentucky people fired up about football, and Tennessee and Florida fan. And this is God's honest truth. I didn't know those two teams were playing each other this week until you just told me that, which would have been unheard of in the past.
Yeah, 7 o'clock kick, ESPN for the Gators and the Vols. That matchup, not what it used to be from a national perspective or from an SEC perspective for that matter. So that doesn't really hurt my feelings either, Wes. I'll be honest with you. The only other game in the SEC this week, 7:30 kickoff tonight. Auburn hosting Arkansas on the SEC network. Auburn's favored by 29.5. And Wes, did you see what North Texas did at Arkansas last week?
Oh, man. Yeah, I did. I guarantee all punts will be covered through, I'll use the phrase again, through the echo of the whistle. The funny thing is, did you read the story about how the first guy down there from Arkansas was asking the punt returner, hey, why didn't they blow the whistle? And starts looking around. Like, he was in on the joke, but
wow,
was like, surely this isn't happening.
Yep.
And then, of course,
that North Texas return man said, let me show you why they didn't blow the whistle. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Arkansas got
I don't know, man. These are weird days.
Arkansas got blown out at home by North Texas last Saturday, first year for Arkansas's new head coach, Chad Morris, whom we know all about here in South Carolina. So that sets the stage for today's South Carolina Vanderbilt game. Let's throw it to Collyn Taylor, our staff writer. He's got Gamecock keys to victory.
Yeah, so obviously with South Carolina, the key is probably going to be establish the run game. It sounds like a broken record, but we say it every week. When they run the ball well, it frees up Jake. It frees up a lot of things for that offense to do. So they got to run the ball. And in terms of defensively, you're going to have to force some turnovers. You got to force Kyle Schirmer to kind of get out of the pocket and out of his comfort zone a little bit, because when he could sit back, he could pick apart a defense. So it's that, and then it's really making sure that there's no explosive plays. Will Muschamp said it this week that they really got to make sure that, Vanderbilt has to march down the field instead of getting chunk plays is kind of what they're used to getting. So if they can do that, which I think they can do, I think South Carolina walks away with a win, albeit probably a close win.
Thank you, Collyn. That's Collyn Taylor, Gamecock Central staff writer. And now we will send it over to Chris Lee from VandySports.com. He's got Commodores' keys to victory.
Keys to Vanderbilt victory are, one, win the turnover battle. They did a great job, Vanderbilt did, in the first couple of weeks. They forced 6 turnovers between Nevada and MTSU. Did not force any last week against Notre Dame. Came up -2 in that area, maybe -3, depending on how they ruled the final play, where they had a series of laterals. But I think if you win that always is a good predictor for who wins the ball game in just about any evenly matched game. And I think, number 2, they got to take some chances and not be afraid. They are a slow-starting team. They put a premium on pass protection and jumbo sets and things like that. I think this is a Vanderbilt team that's got an unusual amount of weapons. I think South Carolina can control the tempo in a lot of ways and run the ball. I think they're going to get some points. I think Vanderbilt has got to make sure it responds in kinds, takes some shots downfield, unleashes Keyshawn Vaughn. I think if they can do that, Commodores have got a chance to pull an upset, but they've got to be aggressive.
Chris Lee from VandySports.com with Vanderbilt's keys to victory. We're set for a 4 o'clock kickoff. And Wes, I like that Derek Mason soundbite that we played earlier on the podcast. A street fight today between the Gamecocks and the Commodores. This is one the Gamecocks got to have, Wes. Got to have it.
They have to. And I think it's a street fight, but I think we see offense. I really do. I think both sides are going to deliver their share of punches. I have South Carolina winning the game, but I think it's going to be close, man. I've got 31-28 South Carolina.
All right, a high-scoring game. Interesting, 31-28. Wes, appreciate you, man. Chris Clark, unable to be with us this week. He's been under the weather all week, so we hope to have Chris back on the Game Day podcast next week. Wes, you do a fantastic job. Thanks very much.
Thanks, man. Let's do it again this time next week.
All right, we're ready for South Carolina and Vanderbilt. For Wes Mitchell, I'm Emerson Phillips. Thanks for joining us for the Gamecock Central Game Day podcast.